In June, pop artist Andy Warhol is shot and critically wounded by a disgruntled would-be actress named Valerie Solanas, who tells Jim Gash in this necessarily censored tape.
Valerie, why did this happen?
Because he's a...
Well, let's clean it up a little quick if I can put it on the air. Why did this happen?
Because he's a piece of garbage.
What did he do to you?
Well, let's say, you know my organization is Scum? You know, he wanted more than anything to control Scum. Yeah, we wanted Scum and we got it.
You know, he may die.
Good.
You mean that?
Yeah, I do.
Why do you hate him so much?
Because he's him.
He gave you a part in one of his movies.
Big deal. I didn't ask for it. He asked me to do it.
What do you think's going to happen to you now?
I have no idea. I don't care. I'm looking forward to going to jail because there's nothing out here but garbage.
Miss Solanas is put in a mental hospital. Mr. Warhol recovers.
She was a writer credited with beginning the radical feminism movement, but she will forever be remembered as the woman who shot Andy Warhol, Valerie Jean Solanas. Born April 9, 1936, Solanas was a smart but troubled child. Despite her aggressive behavior, getting her expelled from middle school for attacking a nun, Valerie made it to the University of Maryland, where she earned a degree in psychology, but not without being disciplined repeatedly and ordered to counseling. Solanas enrolled in the University of Minnesota in their master's psychology program. After a year, she became disillusioned and left, choosing to hitchhike to California and then ultimately returning to New Jersey in the early 1960s. With the ambition of being a writer, Valerie was drawn to Greenwich Village in New York City, like so many other artists and poets of the time, and she arrived in the summer of 1962. Eventually, as Valerie Solanas moved back and forth from multiple hotels, typewriter in hand, she became a fixture of the Greenwich Village scene, and a fixture at the Chelsea Hotel, from which she would be evicted several times. In 1965, she had completed her first important work. It was a play that would help set into motion a series of events that would make Solanas infamous. It was called Up Your A**. Valerie would unsuccessfully attempt to have her play produced, but no one wanted to touch a play that had such lewd subject matter. In 1967, Solanas completed what would become her most famous work, the Scum Manifesto. This manifesto would become the subject of academic papers and be referenced by feminist journals. There would also be debates about whether it was a work of satire or a real vision of a new radical feminism. Valerie herself maintained that the Scum Manifesto was a deadly serious document. At the same time, Valerie Solanas was becoming notorious in Greenwich Village and wider New York City, as she was holding large events to promote the Scum Manifesto and her feminist ideology. At these meetings, Solanas and her attendees would network to try and find a producer for her play. Artsy.net reported that, quote, in the spring of 1969, Solanas appeared on the conservative talk show, The Alan Burke Show. The host simply wanted to interview and malign an out lesbian. Burke so antagonized her that the pair ended up chasing each other around the stage. By the time Valerie Solanas was introduced to Andy Warhol in 1967 by photographer Nat Finkelstein, she was desperate to have her play produced. She asked Warhol, who was in his Silver Factory era, to produce the play, handing him her only copy. Andy Warhol accepted the script, complimented her on her typing skills, and promised to read it over. But Warhol was suspicious. He suspected that Valerie was a cop. The play was so explicit that Andy feared it was a setup by the police, who had raided and shut him down before. So when she called back days later to ask about the play, Warhol told her that it had been lost. Valerie was beside herself upset. There was no other copy. She demanded to be compensated for the loss of her play. Warhol complied, and as compensation, he offered her $25 and a role in his movie, I, a Man. She accepted Warhol's offer and would happily appear in his movie, but this wasn't over for her because Valerie Solanas did not believe that Andy Warhol had actually lost the play. She began hanging around the factory, and she was satisfied in her performance in I, a Man, in which she played herself, wittily rejecting the advances of the male lead played by Tom Baker. Solanas had some success at the factory integrating into Andy Warhol's entourage. She found herself at odds, though, with many of the women surrounding him, who were conventionally attractive and came from wealthy families, attributes that Valerie did not share. Meanwhile, Valerie Solanas had moved back to the Chelsea Hotel. While there, she met fellow Chelsea resident Maurice Girodias. Sylvia Miles was there. She informed Solanas that Lee Strasberg would not be in that day. She said that Valerie, quote, had a different look, a bit tousled, like somebody whose appearance was the last thing on her mind. Miles accepted a copy of the play from Solanas and, quote, shut the door because I knew she was trouble. I didn't know what sort of trouble, but I knew she was trouble. Solanas then traveled to producer Margot Feden's residence. She spent the next 4 hours trying unsuccessfully to convince Margot to produce her play. Later that day, Valerie arrived at the factory looking for Andy Warhol. She told Jack Morrissey that she was there to get some money from Andy. Morrissey told her that Andy was not coming in that day. At 2 p.m., Solanas took the elevator up to the factory. Again, Morrissey told her that Warhol was not coming in that day and asked her to leave. But Valerie retreated only into the elevator and continued to wait for Warhol. Eventually, Andy did arrive, and Valerie rode the elevator up to the factory with him. When Jack Morrissey saw her with Andy, he threatened to beat her up if she did not leave. As Morrissey retreated into the bathroom, Andy complimented Valerie on her appearance, remarking that it was unusual for her to be wearing makeup. And then the phone began to ring. As Warhol turned his back to answer the phone, Valerie Solanas pulled out a gun and fired 3 shots at Andy Warhol. 2 of the shots missed, but he was hit by the 3rd. She then shot art critic Marisa Maya in the hip. Then, she tried to shoot Warhol's manager, but the gun jammed. As Warhol went in for emergency surgery, Valerie Solanas turned herself in, gave up the gun, and confessed to everything. During the trial, Solanas defended herself, but her statements about the crime were so outrageous that the judge struck her remarks from the record and sent Valerie for psychiatric evaluation. She was eventually declared unstable and was sent to a hospital ward. In August, she was declared incompetent and was moved to a state hospital. The very same month, Olympia Press published her Scum Manifesto. Shortly after, Solanas was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Valerie Solanas escaped from Bellevue Hospital several times, sometimes for months on end, but eventually she would be found and brought back to the hospital. It was on one such occasion that Valerie Solanas came face to face with former Warhol superstar Edie Sedgwick. After 3 years, Valerie was paroled but then rearrested shortly after for again threatening Andy Warhol. This pattern of release and rearrests for threatening Warhol and his associates would go on for years. In the summer of 1975, Solanas published her own revised Scum Manifesto after Olympia Press went bankrupt and the copyright transferred back to her. Between 1981 and 1985, Solanas was reported as a missing person by her mother. Valerie had spent much of that time homeless and living on the streets. For most of the time between 1985 and 1988, Valerie lived in room 420 of the Bristol Hotel in San Francisco, spending much of her final days writing away on her typewriter. On April 25, 1988, the body of Valerie Solanas was found in her room by a hotel supervisor. The medical examiner determined the cause to be pneumonia. She was 52 years old. The missing copy of Valerie Solanas' play was finally found in 1999 in a box of lighting equipment owned by Billy Name, and it was produced as a play in the year 2000, some 30-plus years after it was originally written. Valerie has become a radical feminist revolutionary thanks to her Scum manifesto. But as for her wider pop culture legacy, she will forever be just a footnote in the much larger legacy of a man she despised.